never dropped a bomb here. But this land is poisoned, not by war, but by silence. While most Americans worry about the next nuclear threat, entire indigenous communities are still dying from the last one. And the scariest part? You were never meant to know about it. So what really happened out here, and why is no one cleaning it up? Out in the sun-scorched desert of the American Southwest, where rust-colored cliffs cut the horizon and silence seems eternal, lies a place that once pulsed with life. Families farmed the land, drank from clear streams, raised their children under the sky. This was home until the uranium came, until the silence was shattered by drills, explosions, and something worse, betrayal. You see, while the world remembers places like Hiroshima or Chernobyl as the symbols of nuclear horror, few have even heard of Church Rock, New Mexico. Fewer still know that it was the site of the largest radioactive spill in United States history, and almost no one talks about the people still living with its consequences. Back in the 1940s, as the world teetered on the edge of global war, America had a plan. It needed a bomb. Not just any bomb, a weapon so powerful it could end all wars by ending everything else. But to build that bomb, they needed uranium, lots of it, fast. And what better place to look than the vast lands of the Navajo Nation? It was remote, sparsely populated by government standards, and rich in radioactive ore. Soon, the uranium rush began. The government offered generous incentives to mining companies, and those companies came knocking on the doors of tribal officials, who, after decades of systemic poverty and broken promises, saw only one thing in that radioactive rock: hope. Hope for jobs, hope for dignity, hope for something better than being forgotten. By the 1950s, the uranium boom was in full swing. Hundreds of mines dotted the Navajo Nation, over 750 in total. Entire families were hired. Fathers, sons, even daughters, blasting rock, digging tunnels, hauling sacks of yellow ore called yellow cake. Many didn't ask questions. Others were never told the answers. And why would they be? The government already knew. As early as 1929, medical researchers had documented the deadly effects of uranium dust. By the 1940s, there were federal films warning about radiation exposure and the need for proper ventilation. But in the minds of the Navajo Nation, there were no fans, no protective suits, no masks, just dust, explosives, and silence. Many Navajo miners said the air gave them headaches. Some noticed nosebleeds that wouldn't stop. The smell of explosives lingered in their clothes. And the dust? It coated their lungs, their homes, even the toys their children played with. But the paychecks kept coming, and with few other ways to survive, the mines stayed full. Then came the sickness, slowly at first. A cough here, a shadow on a lung x-ray there, then cancer, kidney failure, birth defects. Communities that once believed they were immune to cancer because it had been so rare among them were now facing a terrifying new reality. Uranium wasn't just killing the miners, it was killing the land, the water, and the children. And then it broke. On July 16, 1979, just 4 months after the world was shocked by the 3 Mile Island nuclear accident in Pennsylvania, a different kind of disaster was unfolding quietly in Church Rock. The United Nuclear Corporation had built a dam to contain a pond filled with millions of gallons of radioactive waste from its milling operations, but the dam wasn't safe. Cracks had been reported a year earlier. Internal memos showed engineers knew it wasn't built to standard, and yet nothing was done. That morning, without warning, the dam ruptured, sending 94 million gallons of toxic sludge surging into the Rio Puerco, the same water source used daily by families and livestock. It was like flipping a switch from danger to disaster. The water turned deadly in seconds. But the public narrative? That was carefully managed. Newspapers downplayed the story, calling it remote and not an immediate health hazard. No press conferences, no state of emergency, no presidential visit like the one at 3 Mile Island. In Church Rock, there were no TV crews, just silence. By the time local residents realized what had happened, it was too late. Children had already played in the river. Animals had already drunk from it. Some people had already used the water to cook. Radiation levels in the Rio Puerco were measured at more than 1,000 times the legal limit for drinking water, but the cleanup was minimal. Within 3 months, only 1% of the solid waste was removed. The rest, it soaked into the land, into the soil, into the bloodstreams of the people living there. Why was this disaster, one 3 times larger than 3 Mile Island, ignored by the country that caused it? And more importantly, what would it cost to forget? Because the real damage was only beginning. For the residents of Redwater Pond Road, the answer was everything. Their homes were caught in a silent crossfire, trapped between 2 uranium mines, their lives wedged between poisoned earth and contaminated skies. For years, the mining companies had stored uranium tailings, radioactive sludge left over from processing, right next to their homes. It didn't look dangerous to a child. It looked like a hill to climb. To a mother, it looked like ordinary dirt. To government agencies, it looked invisible. But underneath that surface was a deadly reality, radiation seeping into groundwater, kicking up in windstorms, coating food, bedding, and lungs. And all of it was legal, or at least overlooked. The United Nuclear Corporation, like many others, had no evacuation plan, no long-term healthcare system, no interest in cleaning up the radioactive soup that had just flooded a community's water source. And while President Carter flew out to Pennsylvania just days after 3 Mile Island, no one came to Church Rock, not the president, not the governor, not even the mainstream press. This wasn't just a failure of policy, it was a failure of empathy. The difference, Church Rock was brown, rural, and indigenous. 3 Mile Island was white, suburban, and politically inconvenient. One received $25 million in compensation and long-term medical studies. The other, $500,000 split among hundreds of people, roughly $2,000 per life. The trauma wasn't just in the water, it was in the message. You don't matter, you are expendable. And yet, they stayed. Because to the Navajo people, land is not just geography, it's identity, it's family, it's memory. Moving would mean more than just packing up a truck. It would mean severing a sacred bond, one that had lasted for generations, since long before borders or bombs. Some families refused to leave, even when the EPA offered buyouts. Others had no choice but to stay, simply because they had nowhere else to go. One woman, Edith Hood, chose to fight. She'd grown up in Redwater Pond Road, played in those streams, worked in those mines, drank that water. She knew the pain in her bones, and she wasn't going to let it be erased. Edith helped form a community group to push for justice, not just compensation, but a full cleanup. She brought photographs, medical records. She spoke at government hearings, sometimes in Navajo, sometimes in English, always with fire. She butchered livestock to study their internal organs, yellow fat, deformed tissue. She showed it to reporters, to scientists, to anyone who would listen. Most didn't, but a few did. And slowly, over the years, something shifted. In 2020, 4 decades after the spill, the Environmental Protection Agency and General Electric, which had absorbed the mining company, finally committed to a cleanup plan. But there was a catch. The plan would take at least 7 more years, and during that time, the residents would have to move to Gallup, New Mexico. That might not sound like much, but Gallup is outside Navajo Nation. For many, it would mean living on unfamiliar land, surrounded by a culture that isn't theirs, cut off from their roots. It felt like history repeating itself. The long walk, the trail of tears, relocation under a different name. Edith and her neighbors had another idea. A vision, really. They proposed an off-grid community, powered by solar, connected to the land, built on a nearby mesa. A safe place, still within Navajo Nation, where they could heal. But officials said no. Too expensive, too complicated, no power lines, no budget, no interest. Once again, bureaucracy won, progress stalled. And the people, still breathing the same poisoned air, still drinking water with unmeasured risk, still fighting. And here's the irony. Uranium mining on Navajo land is now technically illegal, but the threat never left. Because uranium doesn't care about legality. It doesn't expire. It lingers in the soil, in the bones, in the bloodstream. Some scientists believe its effects can last for thousands of years. Generations born long after the mines closed are still being diagnosed with cancer, kidney disease, and developmental disorders. And yet, the vast majority of Americans have no idea any of this ever happened. So how many poisoned families does it take before we care? How many years have to pass before a cleanup becomes a rescue? And how do you convince a government to undo a silence it was built on? They say radiation is invisible, but on Navajo land, you can see it everywhere if you know where to look. In the bare patches where nothing grows, in the yellowed fat of slaughtered sheep, in the coughing fits of children too young to speak. The poison may be silent, but its consequences scream. What's more invisible, though, is accountability. Because while the uranium was buried in the land, the responsibility was buried in paperwork, reports, footnotes. Everyone passed the blame. Mining companies blamed government contracts, the government blamed private operators, and everyone blamed time. It was decades ago, they say. We're doing our best. But are they? The truth is, the story of Church Rock isn't an isolated incident. It's a symbol, a radioactive bookmark in a much larger chapter of American history, one written in neglect, greed, and systemic erasure. There are more than 500 abandoned uranium mines across the Navajo Nation. Many of them remain open pits or piles of waste, still leaking toxins into the environment. And yet, it took until 2020, over 40 years after the Church Rock spill, for the federal government and General Electric to even begin committing to clean up just one of those sites. And the river that carried 94 million gallons of radioactive waste still hasn't been cleaned. Not even a formal plan. Why? Maybe it's because the damage doesn't come with headlines. There's no dramatic explosion, no mushroom cloud, just the slow, quiet unraveling of lives. Maybe it's because the victims don't fit the narrative. These aren't suburban families with lawyers and press conferences. These are indigenous communities whose voices have been historically silenced, whose lands have been treated as disposable, whose suffering has been politicized, or worse, ignored. Maybe it's because the radiation is hard to see, and people forget what they don't have to look at. But the people living there haven't forgotten. Take a drive through the Navajo Nation, and you'll find homes without running water, 1 in 3 to be exact. And even those with water access are not necessarily safe. Testing has revealed uranium contamination in wells, springs, and even tap systems. Families that rely on livestock for food discover tumors in the meat. Children play in dust that glows under Geiger counters. And still, no national outcry, no congressional hearings, no primetime exposés, just a few grants, a few pilot projects, a slow drip of aid for a problem that floods entire generations. Some activists have compared it to environmental genocide, and frankly, that's not hyperbole. Because what else do you call it when a government knowingly allows toxic contamination to spread across a population for decades, then fails to act? What else do you call it when relocation is proposed not as justice, but as a convenience for regulators? The Navajo Nation was once told that uranium mining would bring them prosperity, that it would build schools, roads, opportunities. But all it brought was disease, death, and dust. And now, with cleanup still delayed and new funding in limbo, many fear that history could repeat itself. Here's the real kicker. The uranium was never even used for energy, not at first. During the Cold War, it was mined primarily for weapons, atomic bombs, tools of annihilation, and where better to dig for that destruction than the lands of people the government had already displaced, marginalized, and impoverished. It's not just economic exploitation, it's historical amnesia, a forgetting so deep that some people, when told about the Church Rock spill, ask if it even really happened, but it did. And while many Americans debate nuclear energy on ideological grounds, clean energy versus fossil fuels, very few talk about the radioactive legacy left behind in places like this. The TED Talks don't mention the Church Rock spill. Political debates skip over indigenous contamination. And when people protest uranium mining, it's often framed as anti-progress. But progress for whom? And what does it say about us if we're willing to chase a cleaner future by standing on poisoned pasts? The most dangerous thing in Church Rock wasn't uranium, it was forgetting. It's one thing to ignore the past, it's another to keep repeating it, and yet that's exactly what's happening. In the same breath that America debates a future powered by nuclear energy, it still hasn't cleaned up the fallout from the last nuclear rush. It's the perfect paradox. Billions in new subsidies for next-gen reactors, but not a single completed cleanup for the 500-plus uranium-contaminated sites across Navajo land. Lawmakers talk about innovation, but what they really mean is reinvention of the narrative, not the reality. Today, uranium mining is banned on Navajo Nation. That sounds like progress, but the mines are still here, the waste is still leaking, the water is still poisoned, and the air still dusty with invisible particles that no child should ever breathe. The ban doesn't clean the soil, it doesn't detoxify the groundwater, it doesn't remove the massive piles of tailings sitting like scars across the desert. It's a legal gesture without a moral reckoning. Meanwhile, the people of Church Rock and dozens of other nearby communities are still waiting for the cleanup to begin, for the relocation plans to be humane, for the promise of compensation to be fulfilled, for the government to see them not as a line item, but as citizens, as families, as human beings. Some residents have given up. They've taken relocation offers and left their ancestral homes behind. Others, like Edith, are still fighting, still organizing, still demanding something that should never have required a demand in the first place: clean water, clean air, and the right to stay rooted on their land. Their proposal for an off-grid, solar-powered community remains frozen in bureaucratic limbo. Not because it wouldn't work, but because no one in power has prioritized it. The excuse? Cost, always cost. As if the cost of cleaning up this disaster could somehow outweigh the cost already paid in lives lost, organs scarred, childhoods disrupted. The irony is suffocating. America spends trillions on defense, but can't find the funds to defend its own people from the aftershock of its atomic ambition. And the injustice doesn't stop at neglect. It continues in the way the issue is framed. Environmental racism is rarely called by name. Politicians use phrases like legacy waste, low-priority remediation zones, or voluntary relocation programs. All of it sounds so sanitized, so official. But behind the jargon are living, breathing people who were poisoned by policy and then abandoned by design. A Navajo child doesn't care whether it's called a remediation delay or an infrastructure deficit. They just want to drink a glass of water without fear. And yet the conversation remains stuck. We talk about the Green New Deal. We debate nuclear energy as a clean solution, but few voices mention the Navajo Nation when discussing climate justice. Few policymakers ask how we can build a greener world when we haven't even decontaminated the one we already destroyed. That's not just a policy failure, it's a moral one. Because if clean energy leaves entire communities drowning in radioactive mud, then who is it clean for? And so, Church Rock remains a symbol of contradiction, of silence wrapped in science, of forward-looking agendas built on foundations that are still toxic. The fact that most Americans have never heard of the 1979 spill isn't just a trivia gap, it's a symptom of how this country has learned to compartmentalize suffering, to bury what's inconvenient, especially when it doesn't fit the mainstream narrative. But here's the twist. Some people are trying to change that. Quietly, defiantly, they are turning activism into survival, building schools that teach both science and history, installing household filters, training the next generation of environmental justice lawyers. A few nonprofits have started showing up, bringing water tanks, testing kits, and legal aid. One donor, after visiting a school with no plumbing, simply said, "I thought third world meant another country. I didn't know it was down the road." And yet, even with this new awareness, time is running out. Radiation doesn't wait for paperwork. And in the dark shadow of forgotten waste, something else is starting to grow. Because what if Church Rock isn't just a cautionary tale? What if it's a warning of what's still to come? Church Rock isn't just a place, it's a warning. A radioactive time capsule buried in the desert, still leaking, still deadly, still unresolved. 40 years after the spill, the waste is still there. The river still contaminated. The promises still broken. Generations later, children are growing up with the same poisoned water, the same illnesses, the same silence. And yet, the land remains sacred. People stay. Not because it's safe, but because it's home. And in staying, they resist. Against erasure, against bureaucracy, against being called disposable. They organize, they testify, they dream of a solar-powered future on nearby mesas. But plans stall, and time runs out. Meanwhile, the world races toward a nuclear renaissance, promising clean energy without ever mentioning where uranium comes from or what it leaves behind. Church Rock is never part of the pitch, and that's the danger. Because if we build a future on lies and unhealed wounds, the past won't stay buried. It will leak back out, just like it did in 1979. And next time, it might not ask for permission. This isn't just about uranium. It's about memory, about what happens when a nation buries its mess, then forgets where it left it. Church Rock may never make it into history textbooks, but it should live in our choices. Because if a future is truly clean, it can't be built on contaminated ground and forgotten lives. So, the next time someone says nuclear energy is the future, ask them which future and for whom. Because justice isn't just about moving forward, it's about cleaning up what we left behind. If this story moved you, don't let it disappear again. Share it, talk about it, search beyond the headlines, and maybe, just maybe, we'll stop repeating what we refuse to remember.